Let's get started again. We'll pick up where we left off just before lunch. Mike has a few comments, and then I'd like to shift focus to the key migratory corridors and crossings and discuss what activities and, what activities people would like to see and not like to see. So Mike?
Mike Setterington, representing the Chamber of Mines. Just on the issue of core calving and post-calving areas, the Chamber made its opening statements around we don't believe that outright protection is required. Seasonal restrictions are fine, so we're sticking to that. But I think there's been enough discussion around the related research that should perhaps be taken off. We don't exactly know what the related research is, and it goes through a permit review process regardless, and it can be refused based on perceived disturbance levels around research. And that's just not mining. Mitch Campbell pointed out too that there might be some research related in calving grounds that the Planning Commission could simply take off because of an initial planning review process, and it might take some more explanation. And another comment I'd like to address for Leslie with the BQCMB, that she suggested it also eliminate any of the aerial surveys. I presume that's geomagnetic surveys. And logistically, that might be difficult to implement in the Nunavut land use plan, just for flight paths and flying. And I'm not an expert in that field at all, but I don't know if they use those geomagnetic surveys to target specific sites, or if they use it for a regional overview to identify broader areas. So it wouldn't make sense to eliminate the calving areas from that if they have to get a regional perspective on some mineral potential. So if they fly outside of periods where caribou are present in the calving areas, I don't see any issue with that at all. And they would be fully aware beforehand that if there happens to be a target identified there, they'd be going through all these restrictions anyways.
Great, thank you. Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. Warren with the KWB. I think we've made our stance on calving and post-calving grounds quite clear in the statements that I've made in our submissions. Again, I don't think the NERB process can deal with these questions. There needs to be prohibitions on mining, exploration, and everything that's listed on the board there. And in terms of the issue that Mike just raised, I do believe that to do these geophysical surveys, you're still dealing, like you need some level of land use permit to be conducting surveys on these lands, in my understanding. So I think that should be included in the plan, prohibiting that if at all possible. Thank you.
Okay. Brandon.
Brandon with the World Wildlife Fund Canada. Similar to Warren, just wanted to, for the record, because you did ask the parties to indicate their level of support for the prohibitions on the board, and as noted in our submissions, we're in full support of what's already listed on the board, with the two caveats of noting that related research will probably need to change, and also that the all-weather roads will probably change in the discussion on linear infrastructure, terrestrial, given the proposals that were in that part of the recommendations document about how it might switch to everything being prohibited or everything being accepted unless exclusively prohibited. But we're in favor of what's on the board.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to echo what Warren was saying. Peter from KWB, sorry. I was also in support of those prohibitions on the calving grounds. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Leslie. Always the last word, Leslie.
I was just going to address the point that Mike made specifically, since it was to the BQCMB, and that was on aerial geophysical surveys. Sorry? Can anybody hear me? Okay. I was told not to get too close to the mic, so. I wanted to respond to Mike's statement about the aerial geophysical surveys and having possible restrictions and timing, etc. I just wanted to make the observation that there is at least one example of those kinds of surveys on a calving ground during calving that definitely was disturbing cows and calves, or at least calves. I don't know if it was during or after calving. Anyway, there is one example of that happening, so that would be an illustration of how the regulatory process doesn't make that, prevent that from happening, and so something needs to be changed. And if the land use plan is going to protect caribou, it should look at that as a possible restriction at least. But of course, our board has asked that that be a prohibited activity, at least during calving. So.
Okay, thanks. Can we move now to key migratory crossings and corridors? And I don't recall, Peter, if there was a specific section in the draft plan that is analogous to what's on the board for water crossings, for example.
Peter Schultz, Planning Commission. The current plan merges calving and post-calving areas and treats them in the same manner. Planning staff do not know whether planning the post-calving area should be treated differently from calving areas.
No, that's not the question I asked. I'm talking about the water crossings, important water crossings, and prohibitions related to those.
They are not mentioned in the current draft.
All right. John?
Thanks, David. I'd just like to clarify that we're using some mixed language again, even when we're trying to move into this next section, and you're using the phrase key migration corridors and things like that. And I'd just like to note that the term key access corridors, as defined by the GN, fall exclusively within post-calving areas. So the plan doesn't contain key access corridors because it contains post-calving areas, which by definition have the key access corridors. And yet, further to Peter's point, there are no water crossings in the land use plan, but there are sea ice crossings.
All right. I've heard from some parties that water crossings, freshwater crossings, are important. They're listed as a seasonal range, so I think we need to talk about it, and if necessary, add them to the plan. I don't know how well they're mapped. Certainly, there's a lot of traditional knowledge related to water crossings, and Warren has touched on them, so maybe Warren can pick up the conversation.
Thank you, David. It's Warren for the KWB. Some of the HTOs submitted maps that mapped water crossings based on traditional knowledge. This is limited. It doesn't capture the full extent of water crossings that exist. There's two key sources of data that the Planning Commission can rely on here. One of them is the Aboriginal and Northern Affairs caribou protection measures maps that map some of the main water crossings from work that was done in the 70s. I highly recommend drawing on that. The other is the BQCMB's Map Atlas, which draws on a variety of other sources to more inclusively map the water crossings from the Beverly and Kaminari records. So I would consider both of those data sources. If, from my understanding, the ANSI maps are probably the main, most important ones that were mapped back then, but there's a lot of others that are also important that are captured within the BQ's Map Atlas. So. And just very briefly, I think I've already made the KWB's position fairly clear on water crossings. They're very important for biological reasons because caribou are quite sensitive by them. The ones along the Thelon, the Kazan River, the east end of Baker Lake and Chesterfield Inlet are quite important for hunting reasons, and the Magoose River and lake area near Arviat for ongoing land use reasons. Those are still very heavily used. They're very vital for hunting. And I also provided significant traditional knowledge around the proper care of water crossings that I believe provides some fairly strong rationale for their protection. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. And just to clarify the way I'm thinking about this in respect to John's comment and Peter's, there are the post-calving and calving areas are mapped. By and large, people are content with those, at my sense of it, as an interim measure and would be reviewed periodically. But there are important crossings and perhaps terrestrial migration routes that are not captured, that are not included in the post-calving areas. That's what I'm talking about, the stuff outside the post-calving area. And I've heard from folks around the table that, notwithstanding they're not in the plan, people would like to see them in the plan. So what I want to talk about is what kind of constraints for activity would people suggest be layered with those geographic locations. What I heard from Warren the day before yesterday was that seasonal activities, constraints on seasonal activities would be part of that, and likely a prohibition on infrastructure close to those crossings would also be something that they would be looking for. Warren.
Thank you, Warren, for the KWB. I'll just clarify. The KWB's position is that they would like to see, the current position was they would like to see prohibitions on all mining and exploration within 10 kilometers of a water crossing. Now, the Kivalliq Inuit Association mentioned that in their presentation the other day and suggested the immediate water crossing areas, so 2 or 3 kilometers around them, activities would be prohibited with a sort of buffer from mobile protection measures. And I think that's something we could consider if it makes it more manageable to put this into the plan. The real goal is a few kilometers around the crossing need to be protected, and we have to make sure that there's silence for caribou when they approach these areas.
Well, as Ken noted, the more precision, the better. So I would encourage folks to think carefully about exactly what kinds of constraints they would like to see and provide that in detail to the Planning Commission. Bruno?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bruno Croft, GNBT. Do we have any information here, maps of the key migration corridors as submitted by GN? And if you could, as an example, bring up the one for the Blue Northeast, for example. The reason I want to talk about it is we can detach ourselves from some of those migration corridors, and there may need to be some temporary measures in place in conjunction with other things. I'd like to make a bit of a case for it if I can. And if not, I'll give it a try anyway. And others can jump in as usual. Can we bring up the Blue Nose East one? No. Yeah.
This is Jonathan Savoy from the Planning Commission. On the screen, the key access corridors as submitted by the GN are the darkest color, as we're waiting for the map to redraw here.
Bring this one here. Bring migration corridor.
Yes, and there are none that appears to be mapped
There's none.
within, for that particular herd.
Thank you. I'll say something anyway, Mr. Chair, just to get us thinking a little bit. The Blue Nose East and Great Bear Lake is over here, Mr. Chair. Here somewhere. When the Blue Nose East come up from the wintering range into their spring migration, they funnel through a fairly narrow band before they come up this way, turn around and get into the calving ground. This is when the cows are pregnant, heavy, slow-moving, and tight in terms of distribution. I could see the justification in a case like this, Mr. Chair, to have some temporary measures in place to minimize impact of those migrating cows, which are actually moving fast because they're heading for the calving ground. Something like that in place. I think it would be worth considering things of that nature. It doesn't mean that the whole landscape has to be shut down. This is a case where, in my opinion, whatever those mobile measures are, could be applicable. It would have a lot of relevance to it. It would be for a short period of time, just to make our monitoring and our precautionary approach to monitoring and managing these a little better. So, and it could apply to some extent, not as much as in this case of Bunusis, but the Bathurst have different conditions. So there's merit into looking at these migration corridor and discuss and talk about it, maybe through those working groups you suggested or other things, but it's for your information.
Thanks, Bruno. Go ahead.
Linda Orman, GM. I just had a question of clarification for Warren, please, with the KWB. So the 10-kilometer buffer strip around water crossings, would that be 10 kilometers in either direction? So 20 kilometers in total. Thank you. Do you want to maybe?
Yes, that's what we proposed in our submission, but I'm going to discuss with the board the KIA's position on the matter and see if we can come to something. We just heard their ideas on Monday, so it's new news to us, and it might be useful, so I think I should discuss them with my board.
Yeah, just so I'm clear, you're talking about a 10-kilometer radius.
Our proposal, as it stands now, is for a 10-kilometer radius around each water crossing. The KIA has proposed a smaller radius with mobile measures to help create a buffer around that.
Denise Bakey, Government of Nunavut. Just for clarity's sake, the GN did make, in our June 2015 submission, recommendations for spring migration corridors, fall migration corridors, rut range, etc. But since it was a recommendation to MPC, it's not necessarily in the land use plan. So we do have our own maps, but just for clarification around the table, it's not necessarily in the land use plan. Thanks.
All right, well, Peter is trying to pull this up. Any other comments? Yeah, Leslie.
Hi, I guess I would just also further elaborate on the KIA proposal, because one thing that they suggested that was worth looking into also was the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be a circular area, that you should keep in mind the landscape features of the water crossing itself. So it could be an oblong or rectangular, something like that. It would make sense to look at the major water crossings at least individually, I think. And then have something like a 10-kilometer radius, which is well accepted as part of the existing caribou protection measures. So not circular necessarily, but something that would be a 10-kilometer distance from any areas that would be regularly used by caribou for major water crossings.
Okay, so I guess there are at least two tasks. One is to make sure that those critical, or at least those very important water crossings are adequately mapped in the plan. The second is to figure out the geographic constraints, the geographic area where the constraints would apply. And the third is to specify what constraints would apply. Mobile protection measures are kind of like the term sustainable development. They can mean anything to anybody. I would really encourage folks to start getting precise about what folks think would be included in that broad category. I mean, I know that the GNWT has mobile protection measures of a different sort than the the ones that were used back in the Kigavik days, the early Kigavik days, the UG days. And it's going to be very important for the commission to know exactly what people are talking about when they talk about protection or mobile protective measures or whatever the term is. And I guess I'd turn it to ask Jonathan the question, do you have sufficient comfort now that you can work with, or do you require more, and what process would you suggest that people follow if you require more?
Thanks, David. I guess, I mean, as Warren suggested, the Aboriginal Affairs maps of water crossings, we have those. If people are comfortable using those, we can use those water crossings as identified. I don't believe have digital files for the BQ boards mapped information. For example, we do have some water crossings identified by the HTOs in the Kivlik region. We have those, we've digitized those, we have them available. So that's in terms of the spatial aspect, we have that. And yeah, I guess we've heard from a few organizations about potential buffers or mobile protection measures within a certain area. We have some input on this, I guess, to consider. If anyone else has additional thoughts, they would be welcome, I guess.
Okay, I'm going to go back to that suggestion I made this morning about a working group to follow up on a number of items. I think this would be an obvious one where the communities, the regional organizations will have some knowledge that they need to bring to bear on this. You've got some information. And I think above all else, people need to start putting some precision around the term mobile protection measures so that they can be made useful and they can be tested because they do need to be tested. I think somebody has said that without careful testing, they're just words on paper. So throw that out on the table, and I guess I would encourage those who are interested to sit down with the Planning Commission and figure out what the best coordinated approach would be to fill in some of these gaps and close some of the circles in advance of the public hearing. Mike?
Mike Setterington with the Chamber of Mines. The application of mobile caribou protection measures, I think, are quite clear to the industry. And I think they're mobile in the fact that the caribou protection measures that have existed since 1978 applied at the time to the caribou protection areas. Those same measures became what was known as mobile through the Keewatin Land Use Plan. And they're made mobile by the fact that we'd prefer to see these protection measures applied not just in the protection area. We'd like to see them applied wherever caribou are known to be. And so that's how we came up with the term mobile, but it's still the same protection measures, just based on where the caribou are as opposed to area-based. So I think it's quite clear and quite specific, and if the Kavalak Inuit Association has done anything, they've made it a little bit more specific and updated to address modern technologies available for tracking caribou, as well as modern mining practices and what we can and can't do to address mitigation.
And that's fine as far as it goes, but I think with GNWT, I don't know, Bruno, if you can add anything in the context of what is being applied in the Blue Nose East and Bathurst, tracking the caribou as they move into different areas, different zones, different restrictions apply. Is there anything that you can add to the discussion here about those?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bruno Croft, GNWT. Mobile protection measures, we're willing to sit down and discuss and explore how it can be applied and what it means from the time towards the end of post-calving to any time during the annual season and through seasonal ranges and through the annual cycle. When it comes to the calving ground, Mr. Chair, the list of items that we saw earlier is what we want. This is what we're proposing. So we will not explore and discuss mobile management action or mobile measures for the calving ground. This is where we stand. It hasn't changed. It will not change for both herds, and I think it's the case for everything else.
Yeah, I understand that, but that's not what I was asking.
Okay.
I know that in the case of the Blue Nose East and the Bathurst, you've worked with the Cleachon and the folks from Delaunay and others to track caribou, and as they enter certain zones, certain constraints kick in. And I don't know that everybody around the table is familiar with that approach. I was just wondering if you could really briefly, because that's not contained in the current mobile protection measure suite. That's a new one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bruno Coffey, Arnold Slave, GNBT. The only one that comes to mind, Mr. Chair, you probably heard about it in the news last year and this winter, is what we came up with, the mobile Bathurst Caribou Conservation Zone. And it's in place to protect the caribou from harvesting in the wintertime. And it's based on the distribution of the collared cows of the Bathurst herd and now bulls as they settle into their wintering range. And it's supplemented by some flying around the edge, and we update that every 4 days. I worked on the last map yesterday. We went through consultation several times with all our groups about that one zone in particular. This is the only one type of mobile zone of any kind that is right now operational. When it comes to footprint on the landscape, like I mentioned in the opening remarks, Caddy Mine, Diamond Mine, and Gachokwa, Snap Lake, others. Then we work with the proponent on those ranges on a case-by-case basis to look at impact on habitat and how we can monitor and make sure that we stay within the best practices, guidelines. Same with wildlife and monitoring and management plans. So there's two different kinds of plans there. If something new comes up, then it does go through the full environmental process. We participate, like I said earlier. We ask the right question. We ask things to be changed. We get asked the tough question. We more or less always kind of find a way to work together. A line in the sand, Mr. Chair, is the calving ground. This is where we will not move. Everything we do, everything we say, is always done jointly with everybody else that we work with. We operate on Aboriginal land, at Cleachon, at Kachon, Métis. That's the reality. Land claims of any kinds, constitutional right, and we don't work in our own bubble. And we will go the distance 3 or 4 or 5 times if we have to make sure that through our engagement process and consultation process that everything is understood, and we always compromise. So I'm not sure if it answers your question, Mr. Chair, but I mean I can take other questions too if you want.
Well, that's helpful, Bruno, thanks. Mitch, and then Carla, and then Luigi, and then Roseanne.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch Campbell, GN. Just towards this position, a couple of things to keep in mind, just some realities that I would just like to share here, maybe provide a bit of an example. And I know we're talking about validating these methods. We know that they haven't been validated. And I'll give one example of a past protection measure that is problematic. So calving, of course, occurs in the spring. Weather is very poor in the spring. As we all know, we've been on these calving grounds. A lot of certainly we've had a lot of HDO representatives and RWO reps in the aircraft with us. You can see low ceilings in calving grounds for well over half of the calving period. Some years, aerial survey attempts for abundance have been completely squashed because ceilings were below 400 feet. This is a reality of these calving grounds for the mainland migratory caribou, particularly during that time of year. And we see that every single time I go out. Odd years, you'll get very good weather there. It's rare. So there's a couple of things I just want to point out. For one of the big protection measures that was out there was keeping aircraft above 1,000 feet. And that is an impossible task during calving. VFR aircraft cannot fly in the clouds. It would be a very dangerous thing, and it's just simply not a legal thing to do with a VFR aircraft. And they would be forced to fly below the cloud base, whatever that altitude would be, to safely get their people back on the ground. So that's one aspect that hasn't worked, that was supposed to work, and in principle, on paper, it all looked very good. Well, we'll just keep everybody at 1,000 feet, and I'll slow down a bit, and that's going to work out fine. But that's on paper. The reality is we can't do that. So that's one thing. The other thing to keep in mind is that mobile protection measures, although collaring is a very big component of that, mobile protection measures will require aircraft for this early warning to find out when animals are coming in. And this is based on the presentation we had heard for the KIA. Now, the same principles apply. Relying on that system at a time of year when ceilings can be below surveyable altitudes means that you cannot guarantee that you can even operate this system. So I just want to point out these realities to show that we're not trying to be obstructionist here at all. We're trying to put this into the real world about what we can achieve and what we can't. And they're very serious questions that will speak directly to how effective we can make these methods at doing what we're trying to get them to do. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to present, but just one other last caveat to this, which has implications to communities, is although there is an aircraft component to running mobile protection measures, there is also a heavy collaring component. And as we know, collaring is a method that is not well received generally across the territory for a lot of very valid reasons. We are working with communities still and we do have collaring programs in the region, but the reality is that the way the GN has been viewing it is that the collaring component of any mobile protection measure would have to increase quite substantially. And there's another reality there that communities generally don't want to see that kind of invasive research if it really doesn't need to happen. So what I'm trying to do is give everybody a sort of just a quick idea of, in the real world, why we're where we are and why we're grappling with these things and why there's a lot of concerns here in moving forward with the mobile protection measures in calving grounds. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mitch. Carla.
Carla Leto with the NWMB. Mitch's last point actually just kind of covered what I wanted to say. It was just some issues with how logistically the mobile caribou protection measures would work. Some questions that kind of popped in my head was, how many collars per herd would we need to make this work, and if that's feasible? And then also, who would be responsible for collaring the caribou and monitoring them? Is that something that industry would take on? Do they have the capabilities to collar that many caribou that needs to be collared? And then also getting community buy-in for that. Currently, there's no caribou on Baffin Island that are collared, and there's very few communities that support it. We've been hearing that from them over the past 2 years, so I think it's going to be many years yet before there's going to be an extensive collaring program on Baffin Island, for example. So putting mobile caribou protection measures in the land use plan for Baffin Island, I can't see that being feasible.
Thanks, Carla. Luigi, I think, was next.
Luigi Toretti, Kitikmeot Inuit Association. This concept of the line in the sand, I was talking about it earlier just in discussions, and you know, during the third technical meeting, I really pushed for the caribou meeting to occur because it's my opinion that if we don't sit around the table and have honest, open discussions and are willing to look at other perspectives and understand where other organizations are coming from, and being willing to be flexible on that, we will not have a very successful public hearing. In November of 2014, the Sabina technical meetings and pre-hearing conference were occurring in Cambridge Bay. The KIA was the Kitikmeot Inuit Association, was complemented by multiple groups around the table because of the level of effort that we put towards the environmental and wildlife concerns and try to reflect them from a scientific perspective onto how Inuit wish to see a project develop. During that meeting, the GNWT was present and was advocating for this line in the sand. No development around the calving grounds. Now, I guess my question to them was, if that's the case, what about the projects in the NWT? Has there been operational shutdowns? Have there been protective measures imposed on those projects? And the answer at the time was that no, there weren't. So I'm trying to move that line in the sand from, I'm not the person who's deciding, but I need to bring something back that the KIA board will be able to work with. And if there's a line in the sand that the KIA cannot work with, it's not going to be a pleasant public hearing.
I don't think you need to respond, Bruno. I think the issues are clear. Unless you really want to respond, and yes, you can. But let me just say,
Yes.
look, I think what we're trying to do, and I'll get back to the discussion this morning, got to give a little to get a little. And we had the discussion about the calving grounds, and we looked through the prohibitions, and that's, I think, broadly speaking, people accepted the prohibitions that were listed on the calving and post-calving area. Broadly speaking, people agreed that working with the GN's polygons, with regular updates and so on, is good enough for now. So I don't think, Luigi, that needs to be characterized as a line in the sand, that the GNWT is saying they don't support industrial development on the calving grounds. That's a position that many people share. So what I've tried to do, though, is encourage people to think about some safeguards, including the sunset and re-examination and a rigorous research and monitoring program in the meantime, and all those things to determine whether or not the prohibitions stand, whether they have proven to be helpful. So I don't want to get into the bun fight on this or on some other issues. I think it's clear, and you guys have both been pretty articulate, and so I would ask that you just kind of park it, maybe take it outside if you want, but for now, let's leave it, because Bruno, you're going to get the target on your chest pretty soon if you're not careful. Leslie. Okay, but please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bruno Croft, non-owned slave, GNBT. Luigi, thank you very much for your comment. I do understand and appreciate where you're coming from. A lot of development on our side, and now we're getting closer to the calving ground where we say we don't want to go there. I understand that, and all of us do. A wrong doesn't justify another wrong. When I say we want to work with you and your organization along the lines of what you just mentioned earlier, Luigi, by looking at all the information we have, including your own, I am 100% committed to do that and others in our department. For example, these maps, Mr. Chair, keep changing. So, over here. I wanted to point out the coal calving area of the Blue Nose East as it was shown over here, in here. And we've got a key corridor coming this way. Well, let's just sit down together and perhaps to this subgroup or other avenues and see how we can come up with this definition of the coal calving area of the Blue Nose East that could work, where some strict guideline would be applied inside of it, and where that line would be, and what's happening outside of it. Like we're not opposed to this, Luigi. And the reason I wanted to say that, Mr. Chair, is because it applies to other groups that may think that way. Again, I can see the rationale in what Luigi is saying. Unfortunately, the calving grounds are located in Nunavut, on most of them. I wish it was the other way around, maybe, but.
Yeah, Brian?
Brian Agluka, NPC. The NPC would like to see if there would be an opportunity for the Kitami Wildlife Management Board be part of those discussions as well, be involved.
And the elder advisors.
As an elder advisor, somehow, some manner, to have more of a broader audience as you're discussing that particular area.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think the approach that we're suggesting is that there be a subgroup of this group that meets to resolve a number of issues that are still outstanding, the Blue Nose East calving ground being just one of them. But the conversation has to be continued after this meeting. You can't just walk away and expect the Planning Commission to resolve your problems for you. Or, if you leave them in that choice, or that place, well, you may not get what you were looking for either. So it's kind of like going to court. Luigi, any follow-up? I saw you nodding.
I
prefer Luigi Toretti, Kitikmeot Inuit Association. I prefer the terms that were used now to the terms that were used earlier. Again, I support the chair's position that we should have some additional meeting for this, and I would really love to hammer down a date or a time frame to discuss a date when we're going to meet. Because without that, it's just going to, your fear is going to happen. It's just going to get washed away, and all of a sudden, we're at the public hearing.
All right, well, we'll get to the follow-up steps probably tomorrow morning when I get through the detailed discussion today. And I know that Miguel has to leave, and I would like to get Miguel's presentation on before the break, just in case it gets too rushed afterwards. So let's, Miguel, how's 2:30 work for you? Yeah. Okay, so let's continue this part of the discussion, and then we'll turn to Miguel. And Bruno, you had to leave, but you don't have to leave till tomorrow afternoon, right?
No, Mr. Chair, I got to be out of here tomorrow, though. So my concern was that I thought that it would get extended beyond tomorrow afternoon or something. I saw an email along those lines earlier, and I couldn't. So, but I'm here until noon tomorrow if it's okay. I mean.
Folks are trying to call in and they're having difficulties. Is there any way we can?
Okay, let's take a 2-minute break and sort out the phone line. Sorry? I understand that, and I'm just trying to juggle things. If we can get the phone lines fixed, then we can have Bartholomew speak so everybody can hear. So we can get the phone lines fixed now, please?
I think it should be clear when people are talking about mobile protection measures, we're actually all talking about a bunch of different things. And if people are thinking that it's a magic bullet that's going to solve all our problems for caribou protection, you know, first of all, it hasn't been developed, but I don't even know, and so this is a question for Mike, has this proposal been discussed with industry? Has industry said this is a feasible way to go? So if that's not the case, maybe it's premature to be discussing that particular version of protected area, of mobile protection measures at all at this time. Because if industry isn't at all willing to entertain the idea of going that way, then we shouldn't be wasting our time on it at the moment, perhaps. But what we should understand is what the options are that are being discussed, and if they are feasible outside of calving and post-calving areas, our board would be willing to, to look at it further.
Thanks, Leslie, and I guess that's what I was getting at earlier, that there seem to be a number of different concepts being thrown around. Some of them have been applied, some of them are just concepts. As Mitch said, some don't work in certain circumstances and are fine in others, and in the case of aircraft, it's advisory to the pilot in any case. It's not legally binding to stay 1,000 feet above the ground. So there are a number of constraints, and what I would like to see is that people come together in the time between now and the public hearing and present to the commission some consolidated list of protection measures and an assessment of how successful they've been and where they've been applied in the past and where they might be applied in the future and what process would be used to validate them. That's what needs to be done. Because otherwise we're just kicking around this this notion that mobile protection measures will protect caribou outside the calving grounds. It ain't necessarily so. Roseanne.
Thank you, David. Roseanne Durazio with the Kekatani Inuit Association. I just wanted to add one thing that came up internally in our discussions with respect to mobile caribou protection measures. And you initially had asked, and I think it's a good idea, that we need to clarify what the definition of mobile protection measures is. And Mitch, thank you for your explanation before. I think even just the understanding of how complicated just a collaring program could be and how much mobile caribou protection measures would depend on a collaring program. I think one other thing that needs to be included in that definition are measures for monitoring and enforcement of those mobile protection measures. And it's come up a lot internally is, well, who would be responsible for monitoring to ensure that those measures are even being enforced? And whose responsibility is it to enforce those measures? And that, what Leslie said about different definitions for industry or for the government of Nunavut, in each of those definitions, is it, in industry's mobile caribou protection measures, is it industry that's monitoring and enforcing those measures? Or does the government of Nunavut have a role in that? And is there a capacity at the moment to be able to be rigorous enough to actually enforce them? So for us, when I spoke with our board, there wasn't a support for that because there just didn't seem to be a mechanism in place. So I just want to add that whatever definition we come up with needs to include a responsibility or a role for the enforcement and monitoring of those measures.
Good point, Roseanne. Who was next? David, did you have no? Miguel? Well, Miguel, why don't you make your presentation now? It's almost 2:30, and we can go from there.
Thank you, David.
Just a sec, sorry. Just to let people know where we go after Miguel's presentation rather. Depending on the time, we'll take another break. And then I want to move from the mainland herds to touch on the other herds and just get a sense of whether what we've talked about works in principle for those other herds, whether there are some significant considerations, differences that we need to think about. And then that'll probably take us close to the end of the afternoon. I'm going to suggest that we meet again this evening, just in case. It's a bit of a risk management thing, but we could probably get away with just meeting tomorrow morning, I think, but I'd rather have some time in the bank, just in case the conversations run longer. And then tomorrow morning, if we're done with the main part of the agenda, we can talk about next steps and get some sort of commitment to those next steps and who's going to participate and how. Okay? Thanks. Sorry, Miguel. Go ahead.
Thank you, David. Thanks to everybody for allowing me to do the presentation a little bit early. With the blizzard that was coming on, I thought perhaps one of the other members of my NTI family would be willing to do the presentation, but nobody seemed to be willing to put on the Target shirt. So I'll continue to do the presentation as planned. So mineral potential in Indian lands, finding the gaps. I certainly want to make the condition that this presentation in no way construes that there is a position on caribou by NTI. That's what that basically says. This is an outline of what I'm going to go through, and I must admit it's perhaps a little bit ambitious. I'll try and take my time with it, and maybe we'll skip over some things. So, how can we make progress? It seems to me that we have to have some fundamental assumptions to be able to make progress. And I mean, we've all talked about these during this session, but I hope that we all agree on them. So, caribou are vital to the identity and well-being of Nunavut and Inuit, being one. Caribou calving grounds will shift over time. Mineral exploration and mining is a necessary component to ensure prosperity in the territory. Not all ground is equal and as rich in resources. So, I hope we're all good with those assumptions. everybody can perhaps argue later. This is something that we have, or David has brought up on a number of occasions, and I won't belabor the point, but we really do need to find a definition on protection or on the various ideas that we have about protection, put labels on them so that we can actually have proper discussions about it. Caribou and mining and exploration. Caribou and mineral resources intersect geographically, as we all know. To develop an approach for one without consideration for the other will undoubtedly result in an imbalance. And I'll just bring us back to David's comment on the three-legged stool at this point. I understand it's not an analogy that's unique to David, of course, but it's important just the same, especially for this presentation. Essentially, this answers the likely question that I'm sure people in this room will have as to why at this workshop in Caribou, this presentation is focused on exploration and mining. So to start out, we should probably review some parts of the NLCA. And this also has very much to do with communication. So Article 11.2.8 or 8.2 states, the land use planning process shall apply to Inuit-owned lands. Land use plans shall take into account Inuit goals and objectives for Inuit-owned lands. It seems to me this could be interpreted in many ways, as with the other articles that I put out. Could we say something like, doesn't this imply that the ones that apply to IOL are decided by Inuit and not outside agencies? We should not have to fight for the rights that we already have, Inuit that is. Article 11.2.1. The planning process shall ensure land use plans reflect the priorities and values of the residents of the planning regions. Do we agree, does the NPC have the same viewpoint as NTI as to who decides what the priorities and values are, and how do we decide who that is? 11.2.1, special attention shall be devoted to protecting and promoting the existing and future well-being of Inuit and Inuit-owned lands. Perhaps this implies that IOL should be distinct in the land use plan. At this point, we're talking about the NLCA, and David, my colleague here, would like to say a few words about other articles in the NLCA with regard to wildlife.
Thanks. Thanks, Miguel. And I apologize for how much text there is. The important text is the one in bold. And I'm just providing this for context. As Miguel mentioned, this presentation is for discussion purposes. It's not meant to represent a position. I work for NTI Wildlife and Environment. My primary focus is on Article 5, which is wildlife. But for everyone here, Article 17 is titled Purposes of Inuit-owned lands. And under 17.1.2, you'll see Inuit-owned lands are expected to include areas with the following characteristics, not in order of priority: areas of significant biological productivity or of value for conservation purposes. Having stated that, though, there's B, which also recognizes areas of value principally for reasons related to the development of non-renewable resources, which is why it's valuable for Miguel to continue with the rest of his presentation so that the balance can also be presented. I work primarily with Article 5, and this is where my emphasis and my expertise comes into play. And there are principles in Article 5. The two that I'd like to focus on is there is a need for an effective system of wildlife management that complements Inuit harvesting rights and priorities and recognizes Inuit systems of wildlife management that contribute to the conservation of wildlife and protection of wildlife habitat. There is a need for systems of wildlife management and land management that provide optimum protection to the renewable resource economy. So there is literature available. I just want to read one quotation. During 1988 to 1994, when weather conditions were more severe, the calf birth rate in the western segment, this is the Prudhoe Bay region, was 64%. The birth rate for the eastern segment, which was disturbance-free, the other section was affected by development, during the same period was 83%. This is Cameron et al., 1995. I wanted to provide some evidence. I'm not saying this is cause and effect. Rarely do we have any type of cause and effect. I think the advice that biologists are providing is precisely aimed towards F, which is to provide provide optimum protection to the renewable resource economy so that Inuit can continue to harvest wildlife into the future. Sorry, Miguel, this is my last slide. Conservation is defined in Article 5, and it also includes principles that include the protection of wildlife habitat and the maintenance of vital, healthy wildlife populations capable of sustaining harvesting needs. And that has been my primary objective working for Nunavut. That is my driving goal, is to assure that Inuit have these rights into the future. Now Miguel will present an equally important side. Thanks.
I don't think I can match you, David. Wildlife is obviously very important, and we really do have to find a balance. And very much in that line, and I did want to say off to the start too, I really appreciate your comment, your last comment, Leslie, where you had made note of what it is that industry needs. And that really gives me a lot of hope that people are actually considering that as well as being part of things. So thank you for making that comment. So NTI's mining policy, and David said he works for Wildlife and Environment. I work for NTI Lands. So this is very much my mandate. NTI will support and promote the development of mineral resources in Nunavut if there are significant long-term social and economic benefits for the Inuit of Nunavut and is consistent with protecting the ecosystemic integrity of the Nunavut settlement area. Of course, what equates to significant benefit is quite often the question. So NTI Lands, clearly, we have a mandate to find a balance between the two. Therefore, we must promote sustainable mineral exploration and mining as well as caribou conservation. Specifically, and how are we doing, Tommy? Specifically to do with IOL and caribou calving grounds. These are some percentages with regard to how much intersection there is between IOL and Caribou Calving Grounds. And they're not insignificant. These were generated, though, from the DNLUP of 2014, and they're separated out into the protected areas that prohibit mining and exploration, and the special management areas. I'm not sure if I can say at this point it's old news, although I did put that in there. But as you can see, the numbers can be quite high, subsurface and surface. 8% in the Kitikmeot of subsurface intersect with Caribou Calving Grounds. These were rights that were given to Inuit. Of course, not all subsurface IOL are for high mineral potential, but I think it's safe to assume that a good amount of them are. And because we've been speaking so much about the Kaminaria Calving Ground, I just thought I'd put a quick slide up to show these intersections. So you can see, if I can get it, so the dark red is the subsurface, and the pink is surface. This also includes crown leases and prospecting permits and claims. From the most recent data, at least that I have, and you can see that they intersect quite a bit as well. It's yet to be determined how much of that will be grandfathered as per NUPA, or at least as far as I know. So I thought I'd try a quick thought experiment. Initially, I thought I might get some biologists from the group to respond to this, but then I thought it might turn out badly if I did. So I thought better of it, and I've answered my own questions here to a certain extent. So, what amount of disturbance to a Caribou Calving Ground would have only a negligible effect on the vitality of the herd? 50% disturbed? That's probably a problem. 20%? Yeah, I still see that as being a problem. 5%, 1%, 0.1%. Perhaps that might seem reasonable. I don't know. Certainly, there are, the reason that I know this wouldn't work out is because it all depends on where it is in the calving ground, when we're talking about disturbance, and how it's disturbed. However, just to follow up on the thought experiment, this is the Kaminaria Calving Ground, as per the GN data. It's about 2.2 million square hectares. This is the mine footprint from Meadowbank around 2010. It's about 1,200 hectares. If you actually draw circles that represent those areas to scale, the GN calving area is 1,898 times larger than the footprint, and it's 0.05% of the calving area. What does this prove? It doesn't actually prove anything. However, it does provide some perspective, perhaps. With current commodity prices and the cost of mining in Nunavut, it will be decades before any significant number of mining projects could begin. By that time, we should have a much clearer picture of the best methods to manage and protect caribou. As we perhaps have noted, the land use plan is a living document which is meant to be adjusted to provide the appropriate balance. We have time to prevent excessive mining, which might be detrimental to the caribou. Thought I'd talk a little bit about risk with industry. For industries that pursue such risky endeavors, mineral exploration and mining is particularly risk averse in terms of the variables that can be controlled. They include cost of operations, and I'm sure that everybody in this crowd knows that operating in Nunavut is very expensive, up to 2.5 times higher than in the south. Industry needs certainty regarding mineral rights. Theoretically, with a land claim, we should have that. And they need access to lands. However, the issue of caribou could complicate things. Considering the cost of doing business in Nunavut and the markets, which we all know are severely depressed, we should be doing all we can to make our lands more attractive for development and not less. Small scenario I developed, and it's really just theoretical. But a company has identified a property outside of caribou calving grounds, having proven resources, and they develop a mine. They secure additional ground around the property, knowing further opportunities make the project more attractive. So if we consider Hope Bay with Boston, or Meadowbank with the Amaroq deposit. As the mine is developed, the caribou calving ground shifts to surround the property. The mine, of course, is grandfathered, but the surrounding property, perhaps, is not. Is this possible? Again, I'm not a lawyer, so as far as interpreting NUPA, I don't know. That may or may not cause a problem, but it seems to me it creates some uncertainty to the industry that we perhaps don't need. And it would be imperative, I think, to make that clear. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, now on to exploration versus mining. And we talked a lot about this over the last couple days. Although the ultimate goal of exploration and mining is focused on resources, the activities are dissimilar. With exploration, we have larger areas, relatively low impact. One of the comments that was sent back to me about this presentation was that I said they were low impact, and they said, no, you'll have to say something modified to that. So relatively low impact in comparison to mining, and exploration is flexible. Mining is the opposite in many ways. And again, something that's been brought up a number of times, one justification for a prohibition type of caribou protection has been the minerals are not going anywhere, but the caribou might. Therefore, the precautionary principles should be applied with regard to their protection. This is correct if the only risk factor that is important is the presence of resources. However, two other factors, again the third leg of David's analogy, should be considered. The socioeconomic needs of Nunavut and the markets that distribute the resources. I think everybody's pretty familiar with this. For a prosperous and equitable future, Nunavut needs infrastructure, employment, training, and social programs. And readily admit, of course, caribou are vital, but mining and exploration has the potential to provide these benefits. Now, as far as the markets go, process of mineral extraction is very time sensitive. Targeted resource must be forecast to provide a calculated profit which exceeds the costs associated with the building, operating, and closing a mine. The cycles of profitable resource extraction, especially with the high cost of operating in Nunavut, can be measured in decades. And as we've talked about, the cycles of caribou can also be measured in decades. Therefore, it's possible the right time for opening a mine may not occur for 50 or 100 years or even longer when those two factors coincide. Nunavut already has proven resources that fit within this time frame. It takes a long time for a mine to come to fruition. to continue on that vein, only about a 1 in 1,000 resource finds leads to a successful mine. The process of finding a viable resource requires many years of exploration. If mining and exploration are treated the same as prohibited activities in caribou calving areas, the first cycle of discovery may occupy the first coincident opening of a calving area when the caribou move, and then the mining component may have to wait until the next cycle. We're talking about many decades then. This could unnecessarily extend the time until the benefits from a resource could be realized. And that would be fine if Nunavut didn't need the socioeconomic benefits right now, but it does. If we assume that exploration is low impact and flexible, able to provide adequate caribou protection through mobile protection measures, that the exploration work needs to be done to enable appropriate timing for mineral extraction, if we assume that the caribou will move over time and that Nunavut needs benefits from its resources sooner than later, then exploration should be defined as an industry with needs and restrictions distinct from the operations of mining. Almost done. On top of all the complexity involved with existing rights and cumulative impacts, issues of caribou and mining and mineral exploration have emotional connotations. The past makes it easy to love the caribou and just as easy to hate exploration and mining. That appears to make the decision simple, but really it just complicates things, because the future of Nunavut will be determined by the success of both. Perhaps it would be more productive to decide on what we want the future of Nunavut to look like and then work backwards to see what we need to do to accomplish that vision. This is basically a summary of everything we talked about in this. So, any approach in caribou should take into account the needs of industry. Thank you, Leslie. We need to be speaking about the same things to make progress. Inuit-owned lands are significantly impacted by caribou calving grounds, and Inuit rely on much of those lands for future self-sustainability. Considering the scale of development, there is a time to better perfect methods. There is time to better perfect methods of caribou protection. We need to provide certainty if we want to attract exploration and mining. Exploration and mining are two distinct activities that should be regulated distinctly. And Nunavut can have a meaningful and prosperous future that includes both the caribou and mining and exploration. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say, thank you, Luis. Thank you, Luigi. And I thought maybe I should just get that on the record anyhow.
Thank you.
Mitch.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, it was an excellent presentation and did provide a sort of a very good balance of what the issues are here and what we're striving to try and properly balance. And I know this wasn't intended that way, but I just want to, I'm sorry, Mitch Campbell, GN. I just want to get this on the record here that there is honestly no hatred for the process at all on our side. I sometimes might, and I know you didn't mean it that way, so I'll be on the record saying that, but it's just how others might have interpreted it. I just want to be on the record saying that has never been an issue with us, and it oftentimes comes across as that. But I've been in the resource industry in my younger days as well, and I understand, maybe not as well as you do, obviously, but I do understand the needs, and, but that's the main point I wanted to make. This, just a secondary point is a separation between exploration and mining. I have no personal, from a biological perspective, issues with that, as long as the exploration doesn't have infrastructure or occurs during the calving period and doesn't lead to existing rights down the road necessarily. Because I agree with the presentations that exploration, if it's done correctly, can be done outside of the critical periods and doesn't leave a lasting, if it's done correctly, a lasting impact. So as long as it doesn't lead to existing rights down the road, and we can find a way to separate that out, and I'd let my colleagues speak to that, but I don't see how, I can see that that could be accommodated. That's not a, but another quick point, you were also mentioning that perhaps we can allow these mines potentially take a long time to generate. Just of concern is that what if the measures we seek out to validate turn out to prove to be ineffective in calving?
Has left the conference.
So it's a concern that just because we're proposing potential mitigative measures or protection measures or whatever kinds of measures to protect caribou doesn't mean we're going to find that they'll work. So we don't want to say that, well, let's just let things go, and by the time in 10, 20 years it comes around to a different stage of development, that we have any answers yet. We really need, before we get these sorts of existing rights in place, we really need to know that these are going to work and then proceed. So we're not locked into a potential problem down the road. So those are just really quick comments, and just to, again, just to sum up that I really hope that people understand that we, I mean, just on a personal note, I have 3 kids. One of them is and I've talked to McGill about this, is a budding geologist and is going crazy with a rock hammer all over the place, and I suspect that's the direction that he is going to go, and I welcome that, because I think that that's a very interesting direction to go professionally. But so I think there's a lot that we have in common, and we just need to understand that we do have those things in common. We do want jobs. We do want to see things improve. We are of the belief that that can be done in a very balanced form. We can have our cake and eat it too. I truly believe that. And yeah, but thanks for the presentation. I appreciate it. So.
Thanks, Mitch. I think what we really want to have is our caribou and eat them too. Warren.
Thank you very much, David. Warren for the KWB. And thanks very much, both David and Miguel, for that talk. You both raised really interesting issues and interesting things to talk about. I just want to respond to a couple of things that you brought up to continue to muddy the waters, which I think is kind of what your goal was there, was to just raise some more points of discussion, and I'll follow up with that. The first would be that to separate mining and exploration, I'm really not sure that's a feasible thing to do. Even if it ends up on paper, I'm quite sure once a company's invested significant money into exploration, they're going to want to mine there. They have way more resources than, say, an HTO does for a legal team to find some legalistic loophole to get access to those resources. Would be stuck in a David versus Goliath battle trying to keep them out if the community in these hypothetical situations we're raising decided they didn't want the company to turn it into a mine. So I'm not sure that would be a feasible thing in practice to bring forward. And I'm not even sure the industry would really agree to that within a land use plan, or even if they did, I would assume down the line they would find some way to work through that. Two, the assumption that we should be doing everything possible to attract investment, and I can understand that sentiment. But you run a huge risk of joining into what political economists call a race to the bottom, when that's your development perspective, that you need to bend over, to quote the very eloquent Earl Evans. I know, but I'm just saying, to muddy the waters, we need to be sure that this isn't the direction where we're going. When we do everything to attract investment, you can end up in a situation where industry gets what they need, and the people don't get anything that they need. And this is a phenomenon that we've been witnessing globally since the 1970s, of deregulation, of lowering working conditions, of lowering environmental conditions. And even with this race to the bottom, we're still having huge global economic crises. So I think we really need to keep that in perspective when we try to court investment, that we don't join this race to nothing. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. Miguel, did you want to?
Miguel with NTI. Yeah, I don't see any point in arguing the points being raised. However, I did want to emphasize NTI's guiding policy, which is that we are only looking for sustainable development that brings benefits to Inuit. So no race to the bottom. But thank you.
David?
Thanks, David, and thank you, Warren. I know you didn't ask any questions of me, but I'm going to muddy the waters.
You can ask me.
No. What I want to reiterate is how difficult it has been for me providing advice to NTI on this issue, and that's why I appreciated the opportunity to present what I'm guided by, which is a Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. And in it, the points that I highlighted, an optimum system of protection and land management. And if we understand what the constraints are, what the weaknesses are of mobile protection measures, what is there are few options, at least in my mind, when you come to assess what the optimum system is. If your objective, and I've been completely transparent and clear, if your objective is to maintain healthy and vital subpopulations of caribou, at least for the next 2 or 3 generations. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And since we're confessing to things, I'll confess a couple things. I once was a geologist. I once was a geophysicist. My dad was a mining engineer. I grew up in mining towns all across Canada. And I have an education because of the mining industry. The flip side is that I now sit on the Giant Mine Oversight Board, which is looking at the remediation of the giant mine, which is a terrible legacy of the mining industry. Different era, different way of doing business, but I think we need to learn from the lessons of the past, and we need to make at least different mistakes in the future. And I think collectively we're working toward that, but bottom line is I think this is probably appropriate. I was at a oil and gas conference once. A Minister of Petroleum Affairs from Norway was there, and her comment was, if Norway has learned nothing else, it has learned that it has to put the environment first. It's development in the context of environment that and cultural sustainability and community wellness. Let's get that context right, and then let's turn to sustainable and viable economic development. But in the case of Nunavut, there are different realities than there are in Norway. So I think that's the kind of discussion that we're having here today and will be for the foreseeable future. I think your presentation was excellent, and it laid out the challenges that we all face. So thank you for that very much.
Thank you, David. Miguel from NTI. Just as a very last thing, so that's a picture, I was camp cook for my buddy Nycook Hackengak at Byron Bay. So that's just west of Cambridge Bay, about 60 miles west. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Any questions of Miguel? Please.
Thank you. Naklamayok. Pilibi, Kuwaru. Showing caribou topics. It's continuing, I'm hearing things that I understand. You talk about cabin grounds. It's repeatedly said cabin grounds. I just like to support the land is decreasing for some reason, perhaps due to decline of caribou. It's not completely the fault of mining industry and innate the yearlings, the calves. They were like this, as I remember. We are neglecting some fundamental things. There are bugs, mosquitoes, and some other bugs in midsummer have drained many herds completely of blood, especially the young caribou at the height of bug season. And other topic, I'm a hunter, and I have been practicing for many years. Any species that we hunt, some years they disappear for a long time. For instance, polar bear, they migrate as well from south to our land. Our area is in water coming in from Pond Inlet. They're our neighbors, as I hunted polar bear towards east. And the caribous were trying to migrate, and the caribou came across where they have to cross. And I know they were going to cross and with the young yearlings. And I've seen this, and I tell you because I have seen it. And if I've never seen it before, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what I know just by someone reading something to me. I will believe when I have seen it from my eyes. I'm not being, I'm not trying to say I don't believe you. I have seen a lot of data being quoted here and argue and discuss upon. But for those of us who use the land for sustainability, we see, so we believe. But it's still, I reiterate again from this morning, where's the cooperation on something that we're going to present as a finished product? We have to solve this. We cannot continue talking about it. There have to be some action. Something has to be done. To me, when we see these problems ongoing, not being resolved, we resort to fabrication for the sake of an argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Jimmy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Jimmy Haniliak, Elder Advisor of many people. I was going to tell Miguel that Byron Bay, just look at the land and you know, I was going to ask you. But anyways, I'm glad that David brought up the issue of wildlife. And you know, I'm going to bring it to the local level. I'm from Nunavut, Cambridge Bay, and I belong to various boards in Cambridge, and one of them is the ATO. And wildlife in our area, if Inuit do it, try and do it themselves, you know, we will never have any accurate numbers of our wildlife in our area, whether it's caribou, muskox, wolf, grizzly bears. And, you know, we need to keep the continuing work of our biologists. They do the important work, and we need these people to keep us informed of what our wildlife are doing in our region, in Nunavut, and also in Nunavut. Bueno.
Thank you, Bartholomew.
Lou, please, moderator, I'm Lou. Luigi Lock Party. The presenter. I'd like to compliment the guy who wants to do exploration without any much funding. Okay, I have many relatives in Mary River project. Since it's open, my grandchildren, my cousins, they're all being up there. Although they make a lot of money, they haven't bought me a beer yet. But I have also cousins in Rankin Inlet. I have a brother up down there. I want them to have a very good land. I don't want it destroyed there because they're the only source of my caribou food now. I have seen no benefit from Mary River. I just want to put this little joke. I have no benefit from it, but short comment. The caribou biologist, just to advise you, the animals migrating or waterfowls, they usually have leaders to know in fact through rivers, lakes, where they migrate, don't do too much research in that area while they're migrating. Wait until they stop so you would know exactly what's involved. Don't be too anxious to get your findings. Let them settle down before, and that way you will have accurate numbers. If you don't follow, let the leaders stop, then you could do your research. Otherwise, they're not all going to come to an area where they're migrating to. That includes anyone involved in environment or biologists, waterfowl, land mammals.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mitch Campbell, GN. I just wanted to follow up on that statement in that this is the same knowledge and advice that have been provided to us by, I can speak in the Kivalliq region as well, and we follow that to the letter. We don't go into do that kind of work into those migratory corridors because the same knowledge exists, I think, across Nunavut, that it can actually very seriously change the distribution of those animals and their movements. So I appreciate that. It's really good information to get read into this meeting, and it's information that's shared in my region as well, and we do follow that advice. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mitch. I'm going to suggest we take a 15-minute break now, and then either get back to the discussion previous or go to the chamber and then get back to the discussion. Thank you.
As a wildlife biologist, so I'll give this my best shot on behalf of the chamber.
Sorry, Mike, we have this presentation. I don't know if I'm supposed to be putting up the slides or not.
It's one slide. You could put it up, please. No. Overall, I'll just stress again, that was part of the opening presentation. The opportunity for discovery is a key thing for the Nunavut mining industry. That's a key issue. And shutting out areas for discovery is a key issue. Again, not all of Nunavut has been explored, only a very small fraction has been explored. So I don't have the background on how the high mineral potential areas were identified. I believe that database came from Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. And if it was based on the current mining claims, the Chamber would just like to reiterate that basing high mineral potential on current mining claims likely underestimates the mineral potential. Miguel addressed the issue of the fact that during the land selection process, the Inuit-owned lands during the Nunavut land claims negotiations, that many of the lands were selected based on high mineral potential. Many of the existing claims are sitting on top of Inuit-owned lands. And I believe that some of the mines are being developed on Inuit-owned lands. And mineral potential assessments are only as good as the knowledge of the time. So again, this is coming into changes with technology. So future generations and technologies may identify new minerals that are essential to society. So we should preserve flexibility. But again, the industry would need that clarity on the potential for development areas and leave it to the decision of the individual proponents whether they choose to pursue exploration or a project within those areas. Just make the rules clear. And just as two examples I'd like to give for seasonal operations, my company works on several mine sites or proposed mine sites, one of which is a gold mine proposed that operates 9 months out of the year and can't operate for the other 3 months. And that's due to restrictions of snow. So they know they only have a 9-month operating period. So it was up to that mining proponent to decide whether that would be a profitable project or not. As another extreme example of where the technology has come to, there's the Grand Duke mine, which isn't operating right now in northwestern BC. And that mine has a 17-kilometer underground access, tunneling basically under a glacier to get to the deposit. So if the minerals have that kind of value, let the proponents decide whether there's an effective way they can get with it in dealing with the environmental challenges that may be there. There are the possibilities. So outright restrictions on development would just limit, again, the opportunities. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the extent of my presentation. And it wasn't the opening remarks slide, it was the need to recognize high mineral potential, slide 13. Matna.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions, observations from the room? Okay. I think the presentation reinforces Miguel's earlier presentation and adds a little bit more of a context to it. Okay, let's get back to the earlier part of the agenda. I'm just trying to, yeah, item 17. And we left off, I think, talking about key migratory corridors and water crossings. I don't know if there's anything that people want to add at this point to that discussion. I think it seemed to me that there's work to be done, and I'm not sure that it can be done effectively in this forum. It's one of those areas that would benefit from I think a small working group, key people getting together and addressing a number of work plan items, and then reporting back to the commission at one point or another, I guess, with their findings. Mike.
Mike Setterington, representing the Chamber of Mines. Again, I'm going to keep coming back and saying this, but we've been working with protection measures that deal with migratory caribou since 1978. It's in the caribou protection measures. And as an example of an operating site that also deals with migratory caribou would be the Acadian Diavik sites, which have commitments in their operating permits, I understand, to shut down when caribou are migrating through the site. And I think over the years of operations, they've had to shut down in total for about 48 hours in 15 years or so of operation.
Yeah, that's true, but we're talking about not just summer range or fall range, but caribou calving grounds as well. So, and I don't think mobile protection measures have been tested on the calving grounds effectively. And there are different views about what constitutes the suite of mobile protection measures too, so as Leslie and others have pointed out. So Warren and then Roseanne.
Thank you, David. I'll be brief. Warren for the KWB. I must admit I'm no expert on the Northwest Territories mining issues at present. However, at the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board meeting that was held in November, Kim Poole gave a presentation on zones of influence that was drawn from those mines. And shutdowns notwithstanding, I think he showed pretty clearly that there was an impact on the migration routes because of those projects. Whether those had an ecosystemic impact, I'm not sure. But they definitely had a change on the migration routes. What that level of impact that would have in the calving grounds, I think would be probably more substantial from a population point of view. But maybe a biologist in the crowd could speak more to this, because I'm not one. Thank you.
Is there a biologist in the crowd? Roseanne?
I'm definitely not a biologist, but I have a question more for Mike to follow up on my comment before about monitoring and enforcing the caribou protection measures. You'd mentioned that I'm not sure which mine you're talking about, had been shut down for maybe 48 hours in total. So for myself and maybe others around the table, can you just briefly explain how does industry use these caribou protection measures from a monitoring perspective, or how do you enforce those measures? And is it up to the proponent to identify when a mine should be shut down? Or are there other regulators involved in the process that make that decision as to when it should or should not?
Mike Setterington with the Chamber of Mines. I'm not familiar enough with Acadian Diavik to know how it occurs, but it's likely a project term or condition of operation that they must follow. That was probably presented during the review process. Bruno actually might have better information on that. From my own experience with active monitoring on the Baffinland project, our protection measures are coming specifically out of project terms and conditions, and then out of continued regulator and interested party engagement through a terrestrial environment working group, where we review twice annually the project terms and conditions, how they're being met, what mitigation measures are triggered, what triggers those mitigation measures. Unfortunately, we just don't have the caribou on Baffin Island right now to trigger too many of those specific mitigation measures. So I don't have a good example. Red Dog Mine would be one. Red Dog Mine is on the coast of Alaska, and they have spring migration of a herd that comes through that mine site, actually over the access road to the coast. And that's a simple trigger. When they see the caribou coming, they just stop driving the trucks. They let the caribou cross, and the most they've had to stop trucks there was for a day. Let them cross, and then they continue on.
Yeah, Bruno, I don't know if you want to address the diamond mines. I can add a little bit to it. I've been involved in, well, I was involved in the environmental assessment and the follow-up to those. Been on site a number of times. The shutdown, I don't recall the entire mine operation and either of those mines being shut down, but road traffic has been suspended when there are a significant number of caribou in the area. And they have an early warning system. They've got cameras set up to feed into the operations of the mine so that operators are aware when caribou are approaching the mine and then approaching the road, and traffic either ceases on the road or is slowed down significantly so the caribou can cross without significant disturbance. But I don't think that they've ever shut the entire operation down, and the number of road suspensions, I think, or road traffic suspension is fairly low. But that's an area recently where there have been very few caribou as well. I mean, Bathurst herd is the main herd in that area, and it's down to 3% of what it was at its peak. So similarly to the situation on Baffin Island, there are too few caribou around to really be, at this stage, to know how effective the mitigation measures are. Zone of influence, Kim touched on it last night. I was involved in some of that work as well, and it's clear that there are energetic costs related to those mines, and that those scientific, technical observations have been supported by the Clecho observations as well. But in any case, those mines are not in a calving ground. The other mine that I've been to and observed caribou around is the Lupin mine, and there were caribou in good numbers at one time that I visited, but they're all bulls. There weren't cows and calves. The bulls are a little more tolerant of activity. Some of the bulls were actually in the warehouse, getting out of the sun and the bugs. They can be pretty adaptable, but cows and calves were not there. So it does depend on the location, it depends on the nature of the operation, depends on the component of the herd that's in the area. We've heard David summarized the Prudhoe Bay example, where activity on the calving ground has had a measurable effect on reproduction. Bruno, anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bruno Croft, GNWT. I think you've covered it pretty well, David. Rightly so, you've been involved with this process for quite some time. You're pretty much on top of it. Just a couple comments for Mike, if I may. Making reference to the mobile caribou protection measures of 1978 is probably not appropriate. In those days, we were nowhere near understanding movement and distribution of the caribou as we do now. With the event of improvement in monitoring technology, including collars, the big C that some people don't like to hear, especially in the 90s, if we had had enough of those way back then, there's a lot of question mark regarding caribou distribution and movement that we would have been able to answer much better in the 80s and in the 90s. So if we give ourselves now the tools to redefine and redesign a new set of proper mobile protection measures, I think we'd be in good shape, and we could look at all those things together outside the calving area. Just to add a little more to what our chair just mentioned, Prudhoe Bay, I think Mike had a question about using some of those mobile protection measures on the calving ground that it might work. We do not want to tempt that one. We don't want to find a hard way that it doesn't. The risks are just too high. It's one thing to extrapolate for something that was never really put in place in the 1970s to something that could work now, let alone newer technology. So that's the other thing. One final comment, Mr. Chair. As far as shutdown of the diamond mines and all those footprints on the fall, spring, and winter range of the Bathurst, we do have to acknowledge the industry. They've been a really good corporate citizen. They've gone out of their way to comply with the recommendations we propose over the years. Many times we probably got carried away in some cases. They haven't had to shut down the mines, but when animals move within some of the roads, they go into their pits, they will terminate activities, let the cows and the calves do their thing, do time budget analysis for us, like some behavioral work, wait until these animals go out, and they provide us with reports. So there's always improvement that needs to be made. Like I said earlier, we work together. So mobile protection measures, we still have a long ways to go, I think. Lots of work to do to get something in place that will bring all of us in a comfort zone, especially as you get closer to the calving grounds. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. It just occurred to me that one of the other factors in this zone of influence discussion was not just noise and moving traffic and infrastructure, but it was dust. The dusting of the vegetation, and that dust carries a long way from the mine. So there's an avoidance issue and increased energetic costs that is reflected in that zone of influence discussion. But as Warren raised, it's not necessarily clear what the ecosystemic implications are. We're getting a better handle on that. Earl, and then Warren.
Earl Evans, BQ Board. One of the mines that is kind of often overlooked, and that mine, I'm talking about the Colemak mine, is probably the cause of the demise of both the Bathurst and the Blue Nose East because of the location that it's on. Excuse me. And the amount of damage it done to those two herds because of its geographic location is not to be overlooked. I mean, we talk about the other diamond mines further up the road, but as Bruno knows, in the late 2000s, late 90s, that road was heavily used, and that's a main corridor where the Bathurst and the Blue Nose East come down. That's Indian Lake's kind of the splitting point there. And there's been several thousand caribou taken off that road every year. We've had trucks come up there, trailers come up there. All the community hunts were done mostly off Indian Lake and the Snare Lake Road. And Bruno knows that, he flew that. And there didn't seem to be any protection measures whatsoever on that road. Anybody could come up there and hunt, and it was just total devastation. I know in 2007, 2008 was the last year we hunted up there, but the 4 or 5 years prior to that, it was just a wholesale slaughter. And it kind of went unchecked, actually. The resource officers were up there, but at that time, there was no limits on caribou. Every resident hunter in Yellowknife was allowed 5 tags, I think up to about 2008 or something. And all that pressure and no protection measures in place, I think really led to the slide of those two herds. So hopefully we can put some protection measures that are in place that people are going to abide by and can be enforced to help these herds recover from the state that they're in, if they'll ever will recover. But I know Colemak, they were in a stage of reclamation, but even in that stage of reclamation, you still have infrastructure and people can access it. And access is the key to controlling the numbers of caribou that are taken. So I think that's not to be overlooked, that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Earl. Warren.
Thank you, David. Warren for the KWB. I just wanted to raise a few other issues with the idea of mobile protection measures while we're on the topic of it. The first is the issue of minimum altitudes that Mitch had raised before. And he kind of implied that wasn't really feasible during calving season. Every HTO that I've visited, and numerous hunters in Baker Lake, as I've worked there over the past 6 years, all have stories of low-flying aircraft disturbing hunting practices, despite the stipulations that helicopters have to remain a certain height. I don't know what's going on there. I wasn't the one that observed these things, but they say this over and over. So there has to be some issues with that being enforced properly, with weather conditions perhaps. But according to hunters' knowledge, it's still disturbing caribou and it's disturbing hunting practices. Second is the collaring issue that Mitch brought up, and he's right, they're not popular. We've heard numerous concerns that people have with collaring caribou. It's an emotional issue for them, and they really feel it's invasive and disrespectful to animals. Mitch is also right, he works very closely with the HTOs. It's a pill they're willing to swallow because he works closely with them and always brings hunters out. That's the feedback I've heard when I've discussed this with hunters. The third issue was dust that David just brought up. Yeah, that's the other thing that I don't know how mobile measures could deal with this dust impact issue. Kim raised that as a possible issue in the zone of influence when he gave his last presentation. And just on the point of dust, there is a term and condition for the Meadowbank gold mine that Agnico is supposed to suppress dust on their access road. This project is almost over, and they have yet to do that, despite the fact that it's a NERB term and condition. And despite the fact that the Baker Lake HTO, Baker Lake Elders, and Baker Lake Hunters raise this issue at every meeting with Agnico Eagle, and Basil can attest to this. They've raised this constantly. Agnico refuses to budge. So I'm not sure. I think this is relevant as well, that these don't always get enforced properly. And if this was in the calving grounds, I think that could have a much bigger impact. And third is the enforceability of monitoring. And I'll just note that Enconia Resources, a company in the middle of the Kaimanarewac calving grounds, went years without submitting their mandatory wildlife monitoring reports to NERB. And that's quite troubling on both counts. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. And I guess on the implementation of measures, a little story. I'll confess again, I was responsible for the remediation of the Colomac site at one point. And the folks, the Clecho, were really insistent on having a fence built around the tailings pond while that remediation was going on. So we agreed to do that, and I told the folks who were building the fence to make sure that there weren't any sharp angles in that fence, because we were told by the Clecho that wolves will herd caribou into the corners. They understood what I was telling them. I went out to inspect the site after the fence was built, and sure enough, there were more right-angle bends in that fence than I could believe. I mean, it happens. Despite all the instructions you're going to give people, things will go wrong. So, lesson learned there was to make sure that the inspection and enforcement was clear, and the instructions were clear and being followed daily, not just, at the start of the fence construction and at the end of it, because once it was built, it wasn't going to be changed. And sure enough, wolves figured it out pretty quickly and pushed the caribou into the fence, and there were a few more caribou taken that way. I think Earl is quite right that the major effect, though, wasn't the infrastructure at the mine, it was the access to the mine that produced the greatest impact on caribou. Somebody had yeah.
Thank you, Linda Orman, GN. I just had a quick follow-up comment, and also Rosalie had raised this earlier too, on the issue of capacity to monitor and enforce these issues from the regulator. We do not have the capacity currently in the government of Nunavut to oversee this monitoring and capacity that would be needed for enforcement.
Great. Leslie?
Along related lines, I was wondering if INAC would be able to give this group a summary of inspection and enforcement of the existing caribou protection measures, for instance, on the Kaimanarewac calving ground, and if they would have any idea of, at an exploration level over the years, I know there's been lots of caribou protection measures and lots of permits issued, but would we have a good feeling for how much compliance there has been for those? in terms of how much disturbance may have been avoided through the measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer Dewar, INAC. We committed as an undertaking to look in to see some summaries of inspections that have occurred in the past. So we'll do that and report back, I guess, through the commission.
Melanie Wilson, Government of Nunavut. Just along similar lines, I just like to wrap my head around the idea of exploration and mining and separating the two. And this question might be better addressed by the regulators for exploration permits, but what is the current process to inform proponents early on when they apply for permits within calving grounds that they are in an area of ecological significance?
Hi, Spencer Dewar, INAC. Since the implementation of NUPA, all project proposals will have to go to the Nunavut Planning Commission to see if they conform with land use plans. I think in the absence of a land use plan, projects would go to NERB for impact assessment. NERB would make a determination on whether the project could proceed with or without a review, and post that it would go to the regulators, which would consist of the landowners, the water board, Transport Canada, DFO, there's a few others. So, yeah, being highlighted, I guess the land use plan is the first stop to tell if there's areas of high sensitive areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer, for your answer. Melanie Wilson, Government of Nunavut. Prior to the land use, or in lieu of a lack of a land use plan, it was my understanding that there are two avenues through a Type A and Type B permit, and the former being one that triggers a NERB screening, but the latter being one that doesn't require a NERB screening. And the differences between these two are based on logistical requirements such as the number of man-hours, number of fuel stored on site, etc. So how will these, or how have these Type B permits been treated in terms of informing proponents?
Okay, Spencer Dewar, INAC. Under the territorial land use regulations, you can apply for a Class A or Class B permit. And those are, it's a threshold-based system. Under a certain threshold of activity, it's a Class B. In that instance, INAC would send it to a land advisory committee, which would do self-consultation, provide copies to other regulators, HTOs, regional Inuit associations, NTI, Government of Nunavut, for comment and feedback. And then they would issue a permit according to what they've heard. At the higher threshold, it's a Class A, and those would go to NERB for a impact review.
Thank you. Melanie Wilson, Government of Nunavut. So for early mineral exploration where it could potentially just be someone walking on a calving ground with a hammer versus drilling, proponents are informed early on that that is a calving ground, is that correct? Because there are some, from the time I've worked at the GN, that there have been some permits issued on calving grounds that the GN has not been aware of, so, and has not provided comment on.
Okay, Spencer Dewar, INAC, are we talking about land use permits, or are we talking about subsurface rights? Just wondering.
Exploration permits? Mineral exploration permits.
okay, sorry, Spencer Dewar, INAC. So, like, land use permits to go out and do surface activity? Well, okay, so Class A permits would go to the Nunavut Impact Review Board. Class B permits would have been sent to the GN. I can't comment on the specifics, but if one was missed by the GN, you know, we could look into it and see if there was a communication breakdown. But, you know, the process is that a land advisory committee would be notified of any activity that was to occur.
For asking so many questions. The point I'm getting at is if we were to separate out exploration and mining, how will we ensure due diligence with regards to informing proponents that exploration may not lead to mining in a calving ground, and that the risk and responsibility is upfront, and that risk doesn't get passed on to regulators or to government bodies?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking.
It's just a technical question for future possibilities of separating out exploration and mining. And one of the ideas that was tabled was exploration, because it doesn't require permanent infrastructure. If it is done outside a critical timing period, may have low impact on caribou. But the reason biologists are hesitant regarding that idea is the fact that everyone knows exploration leads to eventual development and there's rights involved. And so how will regulators ensure that this is known by proponents and practice due diligence in informing proponents if that is something that we pursue? Well, the land use plan, is that?
Spencer Dewar, INAC. I'll attempt to answer your question, then I maybe hand it over to Ken Landa, who may be able to respond more clearly. I guess any undertaking or permit or application that's received by INAC, there is an effort to consult it out. You know, that consultation is done via, the Planning Commission. If they receive a positive proposal, that's a first attempt to let proponents know what is out there. And then an Impact Review Board, it's a very consultative process where, people get to see what's being proposed and they get to provide comment. And, on the lower the Class B permits with a lower threshold, there would be a land advisory committee distribution list, and we're soliciting comments. So those procedural steps are intended so that the people that are interested or groups that are interested or have responsibilities for reviewing and making comments, so that we can inform proponents of what the regulatory environment looks like.
Ken Landa, Government of Canada. I think I understand your question, and let me paraphrase it back and make sure that I do. Your question is, there is some concern about separating exploration from mining, because current experience indicates that the consultation or the information flow on exploration may not always have been perfect or adequate. And your specific question is, how will proponents be notified in an early way that a project proposal is proposed for sensitive areas? I understand entirely, if I've got that right, I understand entirely where you're coming from, but the past is only so helpful in understanding what the future would be like, because the future is about designing a land use plan that addresses exactly that issue. And demonstrates the information base to proponents that this is a sensitive area. So the particular problems about information flow, about permits, should be replaced by a land use plan that, with GN data, is clearly delineating where these sensitive habitats are.
Yeah, I'll get to you in a second, Jonathan. I'd just add a couple of observations. First is that that process, as laudable as it might be, didn't work particularly well with the Tundra Copper application, which was approved by NERB in a calving ground, despite the objections of just about every other party. So that would be one observation, that the past is not necessarily a good predictor of future good behavior. The second is that there's an onus on the proponent to do its homework too. The third is that given the current mineral regime, mineral rights acquisition and development regime, and we've talked about this in previous sessions, there's an expectation, a reasonable expectation by a company, an individual that's acquired a mineral claim, that it will be able to develop that mineral claim subject to the normal regulatory process. It's, and we've talked about grandfathering mineral rights, and we're going to have to revisit that in the context of this discussion too, maybe tomorrow morning. So there are a number of observations I'd make that the current system doesn't work particularly well in terms of separating exploration from a reasonable expectation that successful exploration will result in the ability to construct a mine, which is, I think, the essence of the concern that people have in that context. Ken?
Ken Land, Government of Canada. I think there are a number of issues raised by the question. I think the particular one that Melanie was trying to zoom in on was those things that go below the NERB threshold, where that process isn't the process that flags it. And so that's why I was focusing on the land use plan in particular at the very earliest stage of the process, that right now the GN is the primary provider of data that will delineate sensitive habitat. And everybody's expectation is, whether there are restrictions or not, prohibitions or not, that those areas will be delineated clearly in the land use plan. So from an information flow perspective, that should be a full solution to the problem, that particular problem that she was getting at. It doesn't solve all problems.
And the cumulative effects discussion and all of that kicks in as well. Jonathan?
Thank you, David. That's exactly what I was just going to mention. In the absence of a land use plan across the entire territory that is managing this information flow and notification to proponents about particularly sensitive habitat, the Commission does still retain its ability to refer below threshold Class B land use permits to the Impact Review Board where it has concerns regarding cumulative impacts, and the information that's been provided by the GN regarding sensitive caribou habitat is something that we are considering when determining if there are cumulative impacts concerns for below threshold projects.
Jonathan? Roseanne?
Thank you. Roseanne Drazio with QIA. I just had 2 points to make. From the perspective of Inuit-owned land, if what you were explaining, a exploration project, were to happen, the process that we in the Lands Department go through is first to consult with what we call our clerks, or Community Lands and Resource Committee, which provides feedback to the Lands Department that we then turn into terms and conditions that would go along with that permit. So if it's issued. So those, that's one mechanism that we have to give feedback on sensitive or protected areas, Inuit-owned land parcels where certain development is not wanted, or so. That's one way that we, from a Inuit-owned lands perspective, can have that conversation with proponents. The other point I wanted to make with respect to the land use plan, a while ago, QIA submitted a notification and consultation guide that we've since discussed with the other regional Inuit associations, and will hopefully be submitting a new version of this along with our comments. And one of the goals of this is to include a requirement for notification within the conformity determination process. So right now, we know more what goes on Inuit-owned land than we do on Crown land, as do communities. So if a proponent wanted to do an exploration or a prospecting, there would have to be a certain level of notification that happened within the community, whether it be the HTO or our clerk. And this would apply to Crown land and Inuit-owned land, which would help this level of knowledge, I guess, as to what's going on in their area. So that's one tool that we're hoping can help kind of level the playing field, I guess, when it comes to knowing what the requirements are.
I thought I saw a couple of hands go up in that corner. Leslie and Luigi.
I was just going to say from the historical perspective of the board again, this was a concern for many years, and the board, the BQ board, was tracking prospecting permits, mineral claims, and mineral leases on the Beverly and Common Area calving grounds. So we put together maps, and the board reviewed them and could see that it was a pretty dynamic situation, but also that a lot of mineral tenures were being issued on the calving grounds. So we, oh, speak up. I was told before not to get so close and talk so loud, so is this better? Okay. So the board actually contacted INAC at that time and said, what could we do about this? And we came to an agreement, so INAC would send information to prospecting permit applicants that they were operating on the calving grounds. And that was presumably done, it wasn't done through the board, it was just done as part of the process. So our understanding was that these companies all knew they were on the calving grounds when they applied for their permits. But yet, somehow there was not a two-way information flow at all, I guess, because then there was this instance, or a couple instances, as Melanie referred to, where they got to the land use permit stage and it went through NERB and they got their permits without really anybody knowing that this was happening. So in particular, GN didn't know what was happening, and that's why they didn't submit comments to the NERB during the regular process. So I'm not just trying to point out that the current process or the past process didn't work, but the communication needs to go both ways. But also, it's not an assurance that a company won't proceed just because they know they're working in a sensitive area. It's up to them whether they continue or not. And this gets to the issue that Warren has raised about social license. Do they want to continue on and take their chances that they will be able to pursue a mine on a calving ground? But I don't really think that helps the situation of protecting the calving ground at all. So that's where the BQ board comes back to the issue of being you need to prohibit these activities from occurring in the calving grounds, because allowing companies to do exploration means you may end up with a mine, and that isn't what we need to protect caribou habitat. So I don't really see as the other conversation is getting us anywhere, I guess is what I'm getting at. So from our board's perspective, we get back to the fact that you don't want exploration somewhere where you don't want mining, and that has to happen through a prohibition and area protection. Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie. Luigi?
Luigi Toretti, Kitikmeot Inuit Association. The KIA also issues land licenses in a similar manner to what Roseanne explained for the QIA. So we do, for new applications, we do consult with, they are not called clerks in our region, they're called CBCs, community beneficiary committees, and so, but the process is very similar. So there's, likewise, in the Kitikmeot, there's, for projects on IOL, there is a better understanding, knowledge of what is occurring on IOL than there is on Crown land at the present time. That's one item. The second item that I would like to talk to is, I really appreciate Bruno's comment concerning new information and using that new information to potentially feed a discussion on mobile protection measures. So I'm actually quite excited to see a potential agenda item for hopefully some more technical discussions on that matter. From the resource allocation standpoint, it's quite disappointing to hear from the GN that there is no funding available to monitor, to provide any kind of monitoring for protective measures. I understand. I don't like it. This is one area that I would suggest the GN have an undertaking to, but maybe discuss with other departments. Is there any funding that can be, if the policy by the GN has changed to not look at those areas as protected areas, and they're going to look at mobile protection as a possibility, then there needs to be some reasonable thought and budget allocation for the assessment of those measures.
Mitch?
Thank you, Mitch Campbell, GN. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And Linda Orman, the GN, just a point of clarification, Luigi, that was, we do not currently have the capacity or enforcement funding to do the level of monitoring that would be required for the mobile protection areas strategy. Kuyanimik.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Mitch, I think you mentioned that the caribou strategy itself, while it promised resources, never delivered.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch Campbell, GN. Yes, that's, we never got the full resources to fully implement the strategy, so yeah, thank you.
All right. Yeah. Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah O'Neill-Sagar, NTI. I think that was largely the point that we tried to come across yesterday with GN's news of the change in their position. But regardless of which caribou protection measures that we narrowed down to, that we hope that those agencies responsible for monitoring and reporting on any of these do come with the resources required, albeit human resources or financial or otherwise. And that's why I had asked Steve yesterday to confirm if the GN will be revising the caribou strategy or not, or what type of resources are put to today's requirements to monitor today's activities or future activities. And I hope that the GN will go back, as Luigi suggested, to take a look internally to see what we would take to enforce any kind of policy direction the GN will be pushing forward. As my colleague stated earlier in their presentation, NTI hasn't come up with its own position yet on caribou protection measures. We will be bringing forward some recommendations to our leadership in the coming weeks, but we had hoped to bring to them as much information as possible following this workshop, following further follow-up discussions as well. We're exploring all of our legally viable options towards a policy decision, and any information or commitment on behalf of regulatory agencies would be very much appreciated.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah.
Linda Orman, the GN. Just to reiterate Steve's point the other day, And that was that there are currently no plans to change or rewrite or reinitiate the Nunavut caribou strategy. Kuyanimik.
Okay, any additional comments? Okay, what I'm going to suggest we do is break now. And I'm also going to suggest that we not resume till 7 tonight, but that we do resume at 7. We should be able to finish this, the discussion of the tundra wintering mainland and tundra wintering island caribou tonight, and then we can get into the wrap-up discussion tomorrow. If we meet at 9 tomorrow, I'm sure we'll be done by noon. One thing I'm going to ask the commission, though, to do is identify for us this evening outstanding issues and questions that they would like to see covered in the discussion, just to make sure that we get as much out of this as we can. I think people are kind of tired now, and it would be good to have a decent break. So, does 7 o'clock work for folks? Are we okay with that? All right.